Welcome back to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw, currently the chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology. We've talked a little bit in previous episodes about things like academic incentives and how they shape the field, as well as maybe some details on exactly how we know when evidence is ready for practice. So how do we integrate those things into making research an implementable idea? I'm not sure that's a word, but it could be a word. So how do we make it something that can happen? We have these incentives that really promote just doing a lot of stuff. We have ideas that right now it's just not relevant to practice. So how can we do that? And so I'd like to spend the next couple of sessions talking about a model that I have that seems to work surprisingly well as an implementation model, which is how it started, but now it's also a research model, and it's evolved heavily into a theory development model. And this is mostly for clinical work because we are really talking about implementation ideas. So the model is called Open Source Analogy Model, or we just call it AWESOME. I called it OSAM for a while. My students said, no, call it AWESOME. It's the AWESOME model. I said, oh, okay, we'll call it the AWESOME model. But the AWESOME model, Open Science Analogy Model. So I guess AWESOME model is redundant, isn't it? I still say PIN number, so it's okay. But what this is, it's an implementation and development research model that's based heavily on open source software. We use a lot of the same analogies to open source software that we see right now, because what we see often now is we see evidence of something that's supported. As we talked about, there's evidence that it works. There's proof of concept that it can work under some situations for some people in some context with some people animating it. We don't know if it's generalizable or works. And then it's hard to get that information. Quite often those things are put in curriculum guides you have to buy or professional development that you need to hire. But open source software is very different, as we know. Open source software is noted for its characteristics of free distribution, sharing the source code. In other words, we get down to all of the details of it, we share it. We encourage innovation and changes in the source code. And we consistently update the operating system so that it's a positive end user piece of software. That's open source software. We often think of it as public or crowdsourced and collaborative in development. And this is another valuable part. We allow the source code to be made available. It allows users the rights to study, change, distribute software to anyone and for any purpose. As opposed to commercial software that's protected by copyrights and patents, the source code is protected, has proprietary protections on it. You can't change anything. You have to do it one size fits all. This is the case of things like manualized interventions. You follow the manual. Well, that's fine, but does it apply to different types of people in different contexts, in different situations with different therapists or teachers or psychologists' skills? Does it account for social differences, cultural differences, linguistic differences? No, it doesn't. It's one size fits all. And while that's good for research, it's really inappropriate for clinical practice. We need a type of interventions when we talk about evidence-based practices that are not robotic, they're not manualized. In fact, they're very flexible. The open source analogy model allows us to create interventions that are like that. So we have a few tenets that we go with. First of all, the materials for all interventions, either psychological or educational, are available for free. Everyone should have access to it. All the psychological and educational interventions have to be grounded in theory. This is a key part of it. These sort of things that we say, oh, it works or it doesn't work is fine. But here's the issue. You can't be flexible with those. And we'll talk a little bit about treatment integrity, treatment fidelity, and flexibility. But in the real world, you have to be flexible. The clients you see, the children you work with, they're all different. They don't fit the median. They're not all the same. So we have to have flexibility. The problem with flexibility, and we'll just probably get ahead of myself here, but when you're flexible, if there's not a theory or a model, then you don't know what you can change and what you can't change. The idea that we have treatment fidelity and that we have to apply things as said 100% of the time is just not accurate. And it's just not good practice anyway. We're going to have to change it. But the problem is there are some interventions that when you change just a little bit, it falls apart completely. The interventions are not robust at all. They work only in one way. Those, if those happen quite often. In fact, I love the phrase for this. It's called a fatal mutation, which is just bizarre to me, but that's the phrase that's used. So you have to know if your intervention is robust, if there's a potential for a fatal mutation. And what we often see here, and here's how we get around it, by going back to the open source analogy. If we have all of our interventions having a kernel, or a set of procedures that are linked to the theory that cannot be altered by the user, then we have a kernel or a hole right in the middle. We know, when I say a hole, we have a set of ideas in the middle that can't be changed. And this is just like open source analogy. Some of you have seen word processing software that's open source. You can go in and make all kinds of changes. But if you change the kernel, then it's no longer a word processing software. It's something else. And we see an awful lot of this with things like executive function interventions, where people make some sort of change in their executive function intervention. Then it's not, and to some degree, it's not even an executive function anymore because you've changed the core or the kernel of it. You have to have enough of a theory of any intervention so you can identify exactly what the kernel is. Then you know that's the thing not to be touched. The other things can be evolved around it. And this is one of the really important parts of any intervention. Has to have a theory. It doesn't really fit with the open source analogy model. Although we'll talk about in later sessions of exactly how you can use this model to actually create theory. So that's really important. So what we try to do is we have a prototype set of implementation strategies, just as in any other implementation or just in any other evidence-based practice. We have something we know works. It's a prototype. As I mentioned before about when we're going to intervene or when can we use data to actually develop interventions, the problem really is that I've totally blocked. You get to hear me totally blank out here. But when you have the ESSA, the law that says if there's just an experimental result showing the interventions work, that's the highest level. That's not even close to the highest level. I call that proof of concept. It simply means it can work for some people sometimes. But how do you know if it's going to work for all people? Well, you develop a kernel. You know that's the part that can't be touched, or else it's no longer an executive function or a CBT approach or a anxiety-based intervention or a social skills intervention or reading intervention. You know what can't change. And then you know what you can change. You can change things like time, examples, clientele, resources, systems. All those can be changed. And now you can make implementation strategies with less likelihood of falling into that fatal mutation. And so why do we do this? It creates credibility, transparency. It also empowers teachers. One of the interesting things when we did this is we gave teachers an intervention. Actually, we used emotional regulation. That's one of the easiest because there's a good theory to it. And we allowed teachers to make all kinds of changes. Some said it was too long. Some it was too short. Some of the examples weren't right for the culture of our kids. So the teachers got to change it. They were totally empowered to make any changes they want. We did have other teachers. We said, do it this way. Only one way. What we found was interesting. You'd think that do it one way. We followed their treatment fidelity. They applied 100%. Actually, they were like 94% of the implementation were they completely accurate as manualized. They had good outcomes. Pretty much the same as in our experimental group. Interestingly enough, when teachers got to change it, they changed the time, the location, the examples, the exercises, all of these things that they could change. We found the outcomes were almost the same. They were about the same. We didn't see any difference at all. Certainly not a significant difference, but no practical difference either. That's fine. This is when we allow teachers to make the changes. So the follow it directly versus making changes. What we got to see from that is different, because when we ended the study, we just stopped. We stopped collecting data. We went away. I came back like 4 months later, asked the teachers how it was going and if they were still using it. Well, the teachers who were doing the one-size-fits-all manualized approach, you do it this way, they had all stopped. Only like one teacher was still using those interventions. But interestingly, the teachers who were empowered to work, they were developing their own ideas, and really owning the interventions. Even after I stopped collecting data, over 80% of those teachers were still using the same intervention. In other words, it became so much more sustainable when they had ownership, when they knew what they could change, when they were encouraged to change, when they were encouraged to be professionals. It wasn't an idiot-proof program. It was a program for them to succeed. Because it was theory-driven, we knew exactly what they could change and what they couldn't change. So how do we do this? For research. What do we do here, and how does this affect treatment fidelity or integrity? Well, first we have this process. We have the proof of concept. That means we have an experimental design that shows that this intervention is more effective than what's been done in the past. Great. Then we start breaking it down into concept and into the ideas we're doing. What exactly are we doing? What are we teaching at this point and at this point and at this point, and creating it and breaking it down into elements? Once we break it down into elements, we can figure out what the core is. That's kind of fun to do. Then we begin to apply it. We apply it in different settings, different locations, different ideas, different classrooms. At some point, we had over 400 classrooms doing this sort of work, and 400 different teachers all doing their own thing. We kind of looked and found out what was effective, what wasn't effective. We brought it together. We took the best ideas from the teachers, too. This is another good part about this approach. When you have an intervention, and we'll talk next time, I'll show some examples of exactly how it's done, because I'm just giving you a taste of it here. But the best part is teachers come up with so many good ideas that we actually recycled that and put it right back into the core or prototype implementation model, because those teachers had such good ideas. So this really keeps the idea thriving. Once you make a manualized intervention, you write it down, you say you have to follow this. If teachers have to follow that, there's no change. It never gets better. It never improves. It just stays. My view on it is teachers know their kids better than I do, better than anyone who developed a proof of concept or the traditional research approach. The teachers know better. They know their kids, they know their culture, they know their school culture, all of that. So let's trust them. And what we find is some of the ideas teachers had actually worked far better than the original ideas. If we could find multiple teachers using those new ideas and they worked better for all of them, we actually went back and changed some of our prototype implementation. So that's a good way to make an idea of an intervention grow over time. So it's kind of an exciting thing. It seems very clear that treatment integrity, which is treatment fidelity or integrity, maybe fidelity is a better word, that approach seems to be a threshold variable. If you don't identify what the kernel is and allow people to make changes, then there seems to be a linear relationship between the fidelity or how accurate the implementation was and whether the outcomes are close to the original proof of concept study. But when you develop a kernel and say stay away from this, then you find that you can have really low treatment integrity or treatment fidelity. It can be really, really low. As long as the kernel is not touched, then it's okay. So that threshold variable becomes really important. So all I've really, and the other big part I think it's important is that when you allow teachers to make all of these changes, it helps your idea or your intervention work for a diverse group of kids. The teachers know their kids better than the proof of concept creators. So the teachers can make the changes, and we had this happen a lot. We had a lot of kids who come from other countries. They were newcomers to Canada, non-English, non-French speakers. We had teachers who knew those kids and could help change some of the examples and practice exercises to fit their culture. And so it allowed this extra flexibility allowed them to work. It also allows cross-validation of constructs to send it to another country, and we've done this in Poland and in Brazil. Trust the teachers. They know what they're doing. Trust the kids, but evaluate. So I've just kind of barely introduced this topic of the awesome model. What I'll do next time, I'm sure as you listen to this, you're thinking, what the heck is really he talking about? We'll walk you through next time I'll walk through one of the lessons that we did on emotional regulation, show how we did it and how it evolved over time, and how the outcomes kept going up and up and up, as did the not just the outcomes, but the sustainability of it. Teachers liked it and they kept going. So this is just one idea, and we'll talk about next time exactly how this can become. Well, next time we'll talk about some illustrations, so put some meat on these bones. And then after that, we'll talk about how this affects research and can make research more productive, meet all those academic incentives, as well as help build models and build theories. So this is just the introduction. We'll get back to it next time. But in the meantime, thanks very much, and I will see you next time on Building Research Resilience. I'll try that again. Building Research Resilience. I'm not even going to cut that out. See you next time.